United States government has been preparing the revolution in Ukraine for years. It's invested $5 billion so far in the uprising. Where are you getting this information? Do you have a proof that that's the case?
Well, it's public information. You have the folks at the National Endowment of Democracy who have been doing this since the unfortunate overthrow of your grandfather. You know, the Rose Revolution, there were thousands, at least 1,000 NGOs operating in Georgia at the time in the early 2000s that were, very responsible for the opposition movements that happened in Georgia. And this has been the color revolutions that started pretty much alongside of George Soros and all of the other folks that have been involved along the way. And it's something that's become sort of status quo with American manipulation of foreign governments. But it's not something that it comes as a surprise to me. Go ahead.
Right, but so you mentioned Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Kiev 10 years ago, approximately. And back then, seriously, there was a lot of talk about America and George Soros in particular funding them, and he didn't deny actually doing that. But what about now? Would you say exactly the same thing is taking place? Because many people would argue that it's not the case this time.
Oh, it's absolutely the same thing. U.S. aid is implicated. Pierre Omidyar is implicated. You've got the National Endowment for Democracy has over 50 NGOs operating there now. And, you also have the ties into Tymoshenko and, the notorious bosses of bosses, Semyon Mogilevich, who has been a sidekick for the American government, since the, preceding the wars against Russia in Afghanistan. Semyon Mogilevich was a huge supplier of weapons and a huge supporter of American aggression against Russia in Afghanistan in the 80s.
So you've mentioned Pierre Omidyar as the founder of eBay and also George Soros. So when we talk about the big capital and big capital players, we're talking about private business who are still spending their money on revolution, as you put it. What's in it for them?
Well, most of the money is coming from U.S. aid and NGOs. And the NGOs are actually funded by the government. The U.S. government actually funds the National Endowment for Democracy. And a lot of these folks are really closely tied to Shachtman, that worked for Nixon back in the late 60s, and who created this organization. And Cushman now, who heads the National Endowment for Democracy, is, yet another protege of that whole Shachtmanite issues. And you don't have to look very far into Ukraine. The most powerful, most well-known foreigner in the Ukraine today is Yakov Bleich. Rabbi Bleich is the #1 guy that they go to get information in the State Department about what's going on with the government in the Ukraine. He's been there for 15 years, and even John Kerry on his last visit had a private meeting with the rabbi, and the rabbi's tied directly into these National Endowment for Democracy organizations.
But funding social groups or organizations, is it the same thing as funding a revolution?
Well, of course, if they're tossing Molotov cocktails and not having a peaceful and what I would say a intellectual dialogue, using communications and paper and creating, what I would say, town halls and having discussions, that is funding a revolution. If you're, inciting violence and basically the money's going to organizations that may incite violence against the standing government, that is inciting a revolution, and I think it's illegal by international crimes by far. It's we've done it. The U.S. has done it in half a dozen nations in the last 10 years.
But here's the thing: the revolutions that you mentioned, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the revolution that took place or is taking place right now in Ukraine, many would tell you that those are also, besides everything else, a result of acute social protest. Surely you can't deny genuine popular discontent. Even Russian president said the grievances of the people on Maidan are justified to an extent.
I absolutely agree. The popular discontent is one thing, but throwing thousands of Molotov cocktails is a completely different thing. put yourself in the United States. If we had a foreign government funding $5 billion to Canada or Mexico, and then, or maybe a former state that seceded, and then those people in those protests, were throwing Molotov cocktails at government facilities, I can guarantee you they would not show near as much constraint as the Ukrainian government and the Russian governments have shown.
So, Scott, the violence that broke out in Kiev, you're saying that was also planned, or did things just simply get out of control?
Well, saying things are planned or gotten out of control, it's a fine line. There are individuals who are very well trained. These NGOs operate on every level. They operate on the peaceful side, and they also operate on the violent side. I mean, it's pretty clear that the Americans have been wildly successful around militarizing jihad and violence and any kind of operations. Even Graham Fuller, who was very instrumental in overthrowing the governments in some of the former Soviet states prior to the 2000 time frame. At this, the demise of the former Soviet states, these guys were very calculated about working with violent organizations to create uprisings. And, Israel was meddling also in Georgia. And, the U.S. almost went to war because of, senators like John McCain. And these are situations that continue. And, nobody's really held accountable because the kind of rhetoric that's played out in the news is pretty much propaganda. And that's putting it lightly. But
what Kiev has on its hands right now is a burgeoning black market of firearms in Kiev. Do you see that becoming a serious problem?
Well, of course. I mean, any time that you have an unpoliced society and you begin the chaos, it's much easier because patrols are less likely. It's much easier for people to smuggle things in and out of places. I mean, just look at the last 3 years in Syria, how successful the foreign intelligence operatives and the mercenaries that have been operating there have basically destroyed Syria by the hands of foreigners. And this is what will be in store for Ukraine if the Russians don't protect the sovereignty of that nation from the foreign interventionists.
But if you look at things generally, do you think all these other protests going on right now in the world, because there are many of them, there's a civil unrest in Turkey, there is a whole lot going on in Thailand, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Is there a force behind them? Is it the same force, or are they different players involved?
Well, obviously the times that we're going through now and the kinds of austerity that the European Union's gone through, specifically Greece, which is, they've had probably the worst of the worst. And then you have the, what's happening in the Ukraine with austerity measures. People start suffering from an economic explosion that really is in the opposite direction. We're looking at, times like leading up to World War I and World War II, there was a lot of economic, basically despair. And these are the kinds of things we're seeing today because the immensely inflated economic environment that's been created by the World Bank and the IMF and all the regular suspects that have, created a false market and a false narrative around, the domestic products in one country versus the domestic products in the other. And that's why you've got countries like Ukraine where the income in Ukraine is just the disparity comparatively to the United States is almost 10 to 1. So that's the kind of thing that people are dealing with in developed nations. And I think that's the kind of thing that they're uprising against their governments because some of the governments are corrupt and, the people are noticing it. Now, is it induced? Obviously, it is induced when it's in the best interest of the United States. And it's very clear that the United States has spent billions of dollars on this over the past, I'd say at least 2 to 3 decades.
All right, Scott, we're going to take a short break now. Now, when we're back, we'll talk more about Ukraine's NATO and EU prospects with Scott Rickard, former U.S. intelligence officer.